Chapter 19 of the Adventures of Captain Hatteras, Part 2, The Field of Ice. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, Part 2, The Field of Ice, by Jules Verne. Chapter 19. March to the North. Next day at early dawn, Hatteras gave the signal for departure. The well-fed and well-rested dogs were harnessed to the sledge. They had been having a good time of it all the winter, and might be expected to do good service during the summer. It was 6 in the morning when the expedition started. After following the windings of the bay and going past Cape Washington, they struck into the direct route for the north, and by 7 o'clock had lost sight of the lighthouse and Fort Providence. During the first 2 days they made 20 miles in 12 hours, devoting the remainder of the time to rest and meals. The tent was quite sufficient protection during sleep. The temperature began to rise. In many places the snow melted entirely away, and great patches of water appeared. Here and there complete ponds, which a little stretch of imagination might easily convert into lakes. The travellers were often up to their knees, but they only laughed over it, and, indeed, the doctor was rather glad of such unexpected baths. "But for all that," he said, "the water has no business to wet us here. It is an element which has no right to this country, except in a solid or vaporous state. Ice or vapour is all very well, but water, never." Hunting was not forgotten during the march, for fresh meat was a necessity. Altamont and Bell kept their guns loaded, and shot ptarmigans, guillemots, geese, and a few young hares, but, by degrees, birds and animals had been changing from trustfulness to fear, and had become so shy and difficult to approach, that very often, but for duck, the hunters would have wasted their powder. Hatteras advised them not to go more than a mile away, as there was not a day, nor even an hour, to lose, for 3 months of fine weather was the utmost they could count upon. Besides, the sledge was often coming to difficult places, when each man was needed to lend a helping hand. On the 3rd day they came to a lake, several acres in extent, and still entirely frozen over. The sun's rays had little access to it owing to its situation, and the ice was so strong that it must have dated from some remote winter. It was strong enough to bear both the travellers and their sledge, and was covered with dry snow. From this point the country became gradually lower, from which the doctor concluded that it did not extend to the pole, but that most probably this new America was an island. Up to this time the expedition had been attended with no fatigue. The travellers had only suffered from the intense glare of the sun on the snow, which threatened them with snow blindness. At another time of the year they might have avoided this by walking during the night, but at present there was no night at all. Happily the snow was beginning to melt, and the brilliancy would diminish as the process of dissolution advanced. On the 28th of June the thermometer rose to 45 degrees, and the rain fell in torrents. Hatteras and his companions, however, marched stoically on, and even hailed the downpour with delight, knowing that it would hasten the disappearance of the snow. As they went along, the doctor often picked up stones, both round ones and flat pebbles, as if worn away by the tide. He thought from this they must be near the polar basin, and yet far as the eye could reach was one interminable plain. There was not a trace of houses or huts or cairns visible. It was evident that the Greenlanders had not pushed their way so far north, and yet the famished tribes would have found their account in coming, for the country abounded in game. Bears were frequently seen, and numerous herds of musk oxen and deer. On the 29th Bell killed a fox, and Altamont a musk ox. These supplies of fresh food were very acceptable, and even the doctor surveyed, with considerable satisfaction, the haunches of meat they managed to procure from time to time. "Don't let us stint ourselves," he used to say on these occasions. "Food is no unimportant matter in expeditions like ours." "Especially," said Johnson, "when a meal depends on a lucky shot." "You're right, Johnson. A man does not think so much about dinner when he knows the soup pot is simmering by the kitchen fire." On the 30th they came to a district which seemed to have been upturned by some volcanic convulsion, so covered was it with cones and sharp, lofty peaks. A strong breeze from the southeast was blowing, which soon increased to a hurricane, sweeping over the rocks covered with snow and the huge masses of ice, which took the forms of icebergs and hummocks, though on dry land. The tempest was followed by damp, warm weather, which caused a regular thaw. On all sides nothing could be heard but the noise of cracking ice and falling avalanches. The travellers had to be very careful in avoiding hills, and even in speaking aloud, for the slightest agitation in the air might have caused a catastrophe. Indeed, the suddenness is the peculiar feature in Arctic avalanches, distinguishing them from those of Switzerland and Norway. Often the dislodgment of a block of ice is instantaneous, and not even a cannonball or thunderbolt could be more rapid in its descent. The loosening, the fall, and the crash happen almost simultaneously. Happily, however, no accident befell any of the party, and 3 days afterwards they came to smooth, level ground again. But here a new phenomenon met their gaze, a phenomenon which was long a subject of patient inquiry among the learned of both hemispheres. They came to a long chain of low hills, which seemed to extend for miles, and were all covered on the eastern side with bright red snow. It is easy to imagine the surprise and half-terrified exclamations of the little company at the sight of this long red curtain. But the doctor hastened to reassure them, or rather to instruct them, as to the nature of this peculiar snow. He told them that this same red substance had been found in Switzerland, in the heart of the Alps, and that the colour proceeded solely from the presence of certain corpuscles, about the nature of which for a long time chemists could not agree. They could not decide whether these corpuscles were of animal or vegetable origin, but at last it was settled that they belonged to the family of fungi, being a sort of microscopic champignon of the species Erido. Turning the snow over with his iron-tipped staff, the doctor found that the colouring matter measured 9 feet deep. He pointed this out to his companions, that they might have some idea of the enormous number of these tiny mushrooms in a layer extending so many miles. This phenomenon was none the less strange for being explained, for red is a colour seldom seen in nature over any considerable area. The reflection of the sun's rays upon it produced the most peculiar effect, lighting up men and animals and rocks with a fiery glow, as if proceeding from some flame within. When the snow melted, it looked like blood, as the red particles do not decompose. It seemed to the travellers as if rivulets of blood were running among their feet. The doctor filled several bottles with this precious substance to examine at leisure, as he had only had a glimpse of the crimson cliffs in Baffin's Bay. This field of blood, as he called it, took 3 hours to get over, and then the country resumed its usual aspect. End of chapter 19. Recording by Steve Chilvers, Norwich, England.